they were embezzling money from a business and they were using that money to spend on gambling. And when we asked them, so how come you were using that money to gamble? They're like, well, no one else was using that money anyway. It like did not register for them that they were committing a crime that they could be imprisoned for called embezzlement. Gambling is unique and you need to focus on gambling rather than say, there's some other problem and root of this cause. No one goes out drinking or using drugs and thinks, at the end of all of this, all of my problems are going to be solved. I'm one spin away on the slot machine or one hand away, one bet away from making all of my problems go away and even changing my life in a very positive manner.
Today's guest is Dr. Rory Pfund. He has a PhD in clinical psychology and he's licensed in the state of Tennessee. In today's episode, we dive into some of his most recent work and we begin to question, does the existing treatment for gambling addiction actually work? But before we dive into that, I have one thing to ask from you. So many of you watch the channel regularly, but you're not yet subscribed. So if you could do me the favor of hitting that subscribe button, my promise to you is that I will continue to work hard every single day to spread the message that gambling addiction is real. Rory, thanks for taking the time to join me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. And, we had met for the first time at a conference a couple weeks back, and you had brought up a really set of really interesting studies that I hope that we get the chance to dive into throughout the conversation today. But before we dive into those, maybe let's set the baseline for people that haven't seen your work before. What motivated you to start doing research on problem gambling?
That's a great question. It's somewhat of a roundabout path. I was actually not initially invested in gambling research per se, but I was an undergraduate psychology student in Northeast Pennsylvania, University of Scranton, and the faculty member I worked with doing research on the effectiveness of psychotherapy. I was from a rural background, and my experience with mental health and addiction was, kind of touched my life in different ways and with family members. And the message I always got about psychology and psychotherapy was that it was just a bunch of made up stuff that didn't really work. With this faculty member, I just spent a lot of time reading. He wrote a lot of books. He was a really prolific writer, still is. I just ended up reading all of the research on psychotherapy that had been done in the past 30, 40 years. And what was interesting to me is that there were scientific methods you could use to understand whether or not therapy was effective for people. And so I got hooked on that. And when I went to look for graduate schools, I looked at the University of Memphis, where I'm now a faculty member, and I saw that they were doing gambling research. And I thought that was really interesting because I had not seen that advertised anywhere. I was like, wow, no one's talking about this. Like, this is interesting. So that kind of brought me in, and I had roommates in college who would gamble on sports, and it was just always something that people would talk about, and we do March Madness pools and those things. When I found out that there was such little research on gambling, I thought, wow, this is something where I could maybe have some freedom to do what I want. And the rest is history. I came to University of Memphis and started asking research questions about the effectiveness of therapy for people who want to change their gambling and experience gambling problems. It was a really good experience because I think there's a lot of impact that you could have here. For the last 10 years, I've just really been focused on gambling because I think there's just so few people doing it, and there's a real impact that I could have. So it was somewhat of a roundabout path, but I'm really pleased and excited with where I've ended up.
Yeah, I found that particularly interesting about your presentation that you had given at that conference that we met, because when I was first trying to stop gambling, I sought out a therapist, and we were working together on a weekly basis, but it wasn't helping me stop gambling. It felt like we were actually approaching the situation backwards. Like we were focusing on, why am I feeling depressed? Why am I feeling anxious? When the reality was, I was feeling these things because I was broke from gambling too much, and I was anxious because I didn't know how to hide it from other people anymore. When thinking about therapy, I feel like the general public probably believes that if a counselor, if a psychologist, if anyone's facilitating therapy, it must work, right? Like they're not just doing it because they think it could work. What's the experience been kind of pushing back on therapeutic methods that people have long believed to be effective?
Oh, it's a great question. It's really challenging. There's a number of points in there that I think are important to highlight. One is that I do think there's a societal and cultural belief that people who experience gambling problems are just depressed, or they're just unhappy, or there's some root cause that if we figure that out, we can change the whole picture. That is like intuitive and it makes sense, but in terms of like the actual empirical research on that, I'd say from a treatment perspective, you're exactly right. It's backward. So if you look at a lot of historical research on gambling treatment, particularly from the medical model and pharmacological treatments, the way that they conceptually think of a gambling problem is exactly how you described it, that if we just cured this person's depression and gave them a pill, they would stop this. Well, the empirical evidence shows when you give people antidepressants and expect that to solely stop gambling, there's really not a whole lot of evidence and rigor behind that research to say that's true. And from my kind of clinical experience working in this space and also the research, what's really important seems to be that there is a clear and explicit focus on the gambling behavior itself within the context of someone's life to effectively enact change, at least in the short term. We don't know much about the long term, but I think you're right from that angle. And then, the other side of, well, treatment providers, what do they think? From a therapy side, the predominant belief is kind of this 12-step model, which there's definitely some evidence for. Gamblers Anonymous, even attending things like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous to facilitate changes in behavior. The problem with that research from a methodological standpoint is it's correlational. And so these programs don't really allow researchers, for good reason, to come into these programs, very rigorously test GA meetings, for example. And so what that research looks like is we just ask people, how many GA meetings did you go to? And then we see how does that correlate with what gambling behavior they have. Unfortunately, that doesn't really causally prove that the GA is the thing that effectively helps someone. That said, there is some interesting research of, kind of referring people to GA or not, and does that change behavior? And yeah, it does, but it's hard because that seems to be the predominant model, but the evidence is really weak, and it's partially because researchers aren't allowed in that space to do that research. So it's not effective. The research just doesn't really exist to show how effective it could be.
I think it kind of begs the question then, like, what makes gambling research so particularly difficult to do? And maybe is it the self-reported nature of a gambling problem?
Yeah, I get that question quite a bit. I do think there is some error in how people self-report their behavior. There's oftentimes a sprinkle of stigma in here that we just can't trust gamblers. That is not my experience working in a treatment clinic. A lot of these folks are so earnest and desperate to try to change their life and improve their relationships and situations. And so I don't really believe a lot of that from clinical experiences. And the empirical evidence shows that if there are inaccuracies, it's not really intentional or deceptive. If I asked you, how many times did you do anything in the last 30 days?
I have no idea.
You're not going to be able to do that. So that is a concern of kind of the self-report. But the most cynical answer I could maybe give is money. That's why it's so hard, is to really thoroughly, comprehensively understand the effectiveness of a treatment program. You need millions of dollars to do that from a resource standpoint. You need to pay people to engage in the study. You need to pay people to do the treatments. You need support staff to keep the lights on. There's a whole lot of reasons for why it's complicated to do such good research at a high level. And from a kind of landscape standpoint in the US, we are severely underfunded, in my opinion, to understand the effectiveness of these programs. The main reason is that the primary funder of research in the US is federal. It's the National Institute of Health, and they have different institutes throughout that fund different things. Like there's a cancer institute, and for addiction, there's a drug and alcohol Institute. There's two separate ones. They spend $0 every year funding gambling programs. And why? Because gambling is not in their research mission. It's all about alcohol and drugs. And so it's been a while since I looked at the numbers, but last I looked, about 500 million is invested in alcohol research every year to different things, and $0 is for gambling. That's been pretty consistent. It's a challenge from a financial standpoint to understand this when there's not a lot of federal support invested in recognizing that this is a problem and saying that we need to do something about it.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like funding sources are pretty like reactionary. And the fact that there is money for drug and alcohol probably stems from, decades of just people having it be in the limelight. Like with drugs in particular, like the crack epidemic, the opioid epidemic, funding that research. Now it makes sense because it happened over the last, 20, 30 years. Do you think that 20 years from now, gambling is going to have the funding that it needs because there will be enough people struggling?
These are great questions. I don't know. I think the pessimistic side of me would say no, because I think when I first got in this area, there were talks 10 years ago, well, maybe it will happen. And another 10 years has gone by. We see widespread legalization of sports gambling across the US. And there's certainly been talks and emails that I've been put into where people say, hey, maybe this will happen again. I just haven't seen real tangible steps to do that. I do think at the state level, there are resources being allocated for treatment services, not necessarily research all the time, but that I think has improved in the last few years. But from a research standpoint, federally, I'm quite pessimistic about it. I do ultimately hope that's what happens, but there's a lot of political and social reasons maybe why I don't think it's likely to happen at this point.
I usually think with like a marketing mind. And so I often look at things like Google Trends. And if you look at Google Trends and you put the word gambling in, right around 2018 when PAPSA gets turned and sports betting becomes legalized in a lot of states, we see a rise in the searches for gambling for sports betting. But we actually really haven't experienced a spike in search results for gambling addiction the same way. It's been very negligible. If you look at like alcohol addiction or alcoholism, you see these giant search histories for it. But gambling addiction is this under-searched topic, even now when it feels like it's becoming more talked about. So I don't know when that trend will happen, but from like a Google Trends perspective, I think we're really early on in people searching for gambling addiction help. Do you find that at your clinic you could take on more clients? Do you feel like there's a lot of clients coming through?
Yeah, so we're seeing just over 200 new
Oh,
people
wow.
every year. So we have 3 clinics spread across the entire state of Tennessee. We have one in Memphis, which is the westernmost part of the state in the corner. We have one in Nashville, which is our central location. And then we have another in Johnson City, Tennessee. That is the farmost east you can go. We are prepared from a kind of physical location standpoint of seeing people. All 3 locations have a physical space that people can come into. We also do telehealth. What's been surprising to us is that most people prefer telehealth. I'm not really sure why that is. It seems like people want to kind of fit in an appointment between like work on their lunch hour, or it's just easiest to get in your car and hop on your phone or sit down at home and do this rather than travel a lot.
That's what was so concerning when I spoke to Brianna, one of your colleagues, about her study that she did on secret shoppers, which was essentially, for anyone that hasn't seen that video, where they called casinos to see if they had self-exclusion and responsible gambling information. And a lot of them did not answer very quickly. And so, like, striking while the iron's hot, I saw one was like 15 minutes on hold before getting information about self-exclusion, having to go through 2 or 3 phone calls before you're able to finally do it. Like, that person's not going to follow through with a self-exclusion if that's real life.
Yeah, that would be our concern. And our philosophy in our clinic is to minimize the number of transactions. So I don't want people to kind of jump between people on the phone. I don't want to transfer them to different lines. I want to talk to them right to the point without putting them on hold. The reason is that you're more likely to follow through if we're immediately acting on your call and the reason you called, rather than let's wait for a while. people's motivation is very volatile, and if you got someone who's motivated in the moment, you should really capitalize on it and get them the help and resources they need. So, like you, I was concerned because from a help-seeking standpoint, you're likely to lose people just because you put them on hold.
It happens to me. I mean, even in like Instagram DMs, like the number of people that get upset because I didn't answer their DM in the first 8 hours that they sent it is insane. Like I'm one guy. I'm doing my best. I try to get back to everyone that comments or DMs, but it can become overwhelming. So there's definitely the need to have that staff in place, to have those systems in place, especially running a clinic. But diving back a little bit deeper, what was it like getting started with a clinic specifically focused on problem gambling in a world where, as we mentioned, the funding really isn't focused on problem gambling at all?
So I wish I could take full responsibility for it. It's more my colleague Jim Whalen, who's been a faculty member at University of Memphis for over 30 years. He is the person that started the clinic in collaboration with a faculty member who's now retired, Andy Myers. And the clinic started by a guy walked in and he described that the reason he wanted psychological services was for depression. And what the therapist figured out is that the depression really coincided with these days where he would drive several hours to another state to buy a bunch of lottery tickets, like hundreds of dollars worth. The depression was all about the winning and losing and traveling to buy these lottery tickets. And so what they did is they sat down and they said, what do we know about gambling treatment and gambling problems? And there was really nothing out there. There was no real research base for it in psychology. They decided that they were going to start doing this without really any money behind them. Fast forward and forget a lot of the details of what's going on, but Jim Whalen went and really advocated for getting the state to invest in preventing and treating people who had gambling problems. And so at that time, the Lottery Commission actually allowed them to use the unclaimed prizes from the lottery. So people who won the lottery but did not redeem the prize that they won, it would just sit in a pot. And that money was then invested into funding the treatment program here. So the money really just paid for a few doctoral students in clinical psychology to do the treatment program and to do a little advertising about the program. But that was with very little money. It's only a few $100,000 to get it started. And they got that money year after year. Now I think we're in a very fortunate position because Tennessee, where we're at, has invested 5% of all the tax revenue from sports gambling into our program. So we are employing over 30 people who are all invested and working toward the same goal of helping people who want to change their gambling and who are really struggling. So it's been a long journey, I think, especially for Jim. I was here during some of the graduate school days where there was much less money. So it's been really nice and refreshing to see that there's a little bit more of a spotlight right now on gambling, at least in Tennessee. So that's the good news for us.
I mean, it's an interesting story because I feel like that's going to be the natural progression if other states were to try to replicate a gambling clinic through state funding when there really isn't any funding. It does create a lot of interesting dynamics, though, doesn't it? It's like the money comes from the industry that is essentially causing the problem. How do you reconcile that?
It's challenging. I mean, I think for us, we never touch or see the industry. So the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services in Tennessee is really the one who controls this. And they were actually, I think, responsible for committing and making the investment into gambling programs specifically because they are a very large enterprise in terms of what they do within the state from a mental health and addiction standpoint. So they fund a lot of the mental health treatment centers and substance use treatment centers. And the easy thing for them to do would have been to take all that gambling money and just kind of evenly split it across all the existing clinics.
Yeah.
But what I think they were smart in doing, kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, is this idea that gambling is unique and you need to focus on gambling rather than say, there's some other problem and root of this cause. And so they have really bought into the idea that gambling is something that should be highlighted and talked about specifically. And I think they get a lot of credit for this because they could have very easily just said, we'll throw it to all addiction treatment centers. Gambling's another addiction, just go there. I think that would have been a mistake from a effectiveness and reach standpoint. So I think we reconcile all this in the sense that I feel like our partner is really a Department of Mental Health rather than the industry, but I think it certainly stands that there is kind of this ethical and moral dilemma of how do you reconcile there's kind of harm being created and are they paying the problem to go away? It's better than doing nothing, which is what I think a lot of states are doing right now. So while I don't fully agree with it, there's something happening.
Gambling can wreck your finances, but you don't have to handle the recovery process by yourself. At GamFin, they help people struggling with gambling debt to take back control in their lives. Whether it's budgeting, debt management, or rebuilding your financial future, their experts are here with real support. Your money doesn't have to define you. Visit gamfin.org today and take the first steps towards rebuilding your financial future. Hope starts here. Check out the description of this video for a link to check them out. What makes gambling addiction different than other addictions? Why does it need to be looked at separately from drugs and alcohol if theoretically, it's the same kind of process in the brain?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the idea of the uniqueness of gambling is not highlighted enough. And for me, the main difference relative to other addiction, particularly substance use disorder, which is the most well-funded and highlighted addiction within our American culture, people who use substances do not have the hope that people with gambling do. And what I mean by that is no one goes out drinking or using drugs and thinks, at the end of all of this, all of my problems are going to be solved. And I think that is what makes gambling so unique, is that there's an inherent hope and optimism in the problem that helps maintain the addiction, that people believe, I'm one spin away on the slot machine or one hand away, one bet away from making all of my problems go away and even changing my life in a very positive manner. The other difference, I think, is that with gambling, you don't physiologically change the body. Like, there's no intoxication point like there is for alcohol and drugs. And so that I think is unique to highlight. Why that is so important clinically is because we have tons of clients who come to our clinic who are so happy that we're focusing on gambling, because what they've been told previously is, well, I went to some other addiction clinic and what they said is, well, you have gambling. That's just like every other addiction. And the therapist didn't know anything about gambling. And that's really how they felt, is that it wasn't that it was similar. The therapist just didn't know about what my problem, and they didn't know how to help me.
Yeah, like when I was seeing my therapist, it felt like I was explaining to him like what a parlay was, like what kind of bets I was making. It felt more like I was like educating him on gambling when I wanted him to be the authority figure and trying to give me the steps I needed to get better.
Yeah.
Do you feel like those same clients, the younger clients, what are kind of some of the misconceptions that they have about their own gambling? Like, for example, a lot of my younger audience, especially on TikTok, they have this correlation in their head that sports betting is like investing. Like, is that kind of a misconception that you run into?
Oh yeah, we see stuff like that all the time. And I'd say from a clinical standpoint, that's somewhat challenging, because the goal essentially of the treatment, in some ways, one of the goals is we are trying for every individual person to change the way they think about gambling. And so if you have solidified in your mind that this is a legitimate investing strategy, that's really hard to disprove. What we do are things like we test that. And so part of this is we're psychologists who are very scientifically driven. And so I want to test that. So if a client says, I found this investment strategy where I'm making all this money, I say, well, let's look at that. I want to invite you to show me how much money you're making. And so what we actually do is we have them chart their wins and losses. And, every once in a while, there's like one or two people who, they're not making a boatload of money. They're maybe breaking even. They won a nice win here or there. I have never in all of the years treating people in the clinic, supervising people in the clinic, seen anyone that has made a legitimate return on their investments that would be comparable to other investments like a Roth IRA. So why are you investing in gambling and not a Roth IRA? I mean, that's a legitimate clinical question I might ask someone. And when you lay it out on paper, some of those younger guys start to say, well, geez, yeah, the percent return on this isn't maybe as high as I thought it was. And then the conversation changes. So I would say that is a very common conception of a lot of clients, not just young men, but a lot of people believe, this is a legitimate way to make money. I think arguably different forms of gambling are going to have different types of arguments for how that might be true. Like, poker and sports gambling are seen as these games of skill. I've still, in my clinical practice and experience, not seen really anyone that's winning a boatload of money. And that's certainly not true for slot machines mathematically or other casino games. I mean, they are designed for you to lose. That's why casinos are so beautiful and lavish inside, and they can give out alcohol for free. That's the business model. So those clients are a little bit easier to change the mindset on, in my experience.
Now, I'll play devil's advocate because the people that are coming to you are those that are struggling with gambling problems. They're making the decision to go out and seek help for it in some way. Are those just the bad gamblers? Are there strategies thought through? Like, what is the reason that they're losing, but someone who's an influencer online is winning big, in your opinion?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I'm not sure. I mean, yeah, I think that would be one way to look at it, is maybe these are just the bad gamblers. I will say that a lot of the people that come to our clinic keep really meticulous financial records of their spending. They have articulated strategies about how they win. They have plans and limits that they set for themselves. I think the problem is that within our clinic, this is a set of people who are experiencing, diagnosable psychological problems that some of their beliefs are really not founded in fact or reality. And I think that's what makes gambling so challenging, is that gambling is designed to create these cognitive delusional beliefs about winning and success, and that's just literally how it was designed inherently. And so, yeah, I think there's probably some truth to the, some of them are maybe just not in control of their behavior. And the truth is, diagnostically, the majority of people who gamble do so without any problems. It is a fun, normal, reasonable activity for them. And then there is a small percentage of people, about 1% to 2%, who experience harm. And so I don't know if I'd call them bad gamblers, but I do think things have gotten out of control.
I like the way that you answered it, though, because the fact that they are able to articulate strategies, I'm only thinking as a cynic because of the kinds of comments that I get when I post stuff online, right? Like, people are like, Rob, you're a bad gambler, leave me alone, I can do whatever I want, kind of thing. What you're saying is that people that are coming into a clinic to get help for a gambling problem aren't just willy-nilly like betting on whatever they want. They actually have strategies, they have thought going into it, they have research going into it, with the baseline being, you're not going to make money, this isn't a great investment. Doesn't mean that you're going to have a problem with it if you keep going. You might, but it means that it's not a good investment of money. And I think that's the underlying truth for, I would go as far as blanketing that to all forms of gambling. But I get hate for that in the comments anyway. With that being said, I wanted to give you a space here to also share about your most recent study that you've been able to publish in the journal. What was it, and where can someone find it?
So we do a ton of research. I think some of the stuff I'm really proud of right now we are testing the effectiveness of what are established treatment programs within psychology. And I think the way we're conceptualizing this from a research standpoint is we want to raise the bar in terms of having a higher standard for what is deemed effective. So one of the most well-established treatments within our research area is motivational interviewing. A lot of people have probably heard or seen something about that treatment, but essentially what it is that we help, as psychologists, people become more motivated to change their behavior, and in this instance, gambling. And so we do things like we ask them what their values are in life, and we help them figure out who they want to be within the future. And we try to understand, where does gambling fit into that. It's a very oversimplified explanation of what the treatment is. But what we find is that within our randomized clinical trials, which are comparisons of that treatment relative to no treatment, or some kind of minimal standard of a treatment program, like someone telling you just stop gambling, you should just stop it, advice. When you compare motivational interviewing to advice or just no treatment, we actually find no difference in the outcomes. And those outcomes are how severe your gambling problem is, where we just count kind of the number of consequences you might experience, like arguments at home, financial strain, things like that. The other outcomes are gambling behavior, things like how often you gamble, how many days in a month, as well as how much money you spend on gambling. We don't see any differences between that treatment, which is so highly touted within the therapy research literature, and just nothing. That doesn't mean that that treatment is not effective. I think that means is that we haven't really done enough research to figure out how it's effective. So we use that type of treatment within in our treatment clinic here in Memphis, but it is not the only thing we do. So these studies, the problem, and I think why this is not effective, is that it was the only component of their treatment. And so conceptually, what that means is that if you only use a motivational interview to get someone to change their gambling behavior, what that assumes is if you just make someone motivated to make a change, that will be sufficient to make that change. To that, I highly disagree. You could have all the motivation in the world and maybe not the skills or things set up in your life to make you successful. So if you're in such a financial jam that you can't get resources or access other things beside gambling, but we motivate you as much as possible, that's not necessarily going to mean you're effective. And so basically our recommendation from this report is you need to combine this with another treatment, particularly cognitive behavioral treatment, because that program will give you skills and help you problem solve all of the challenges that gambling problems have maybe created in your life. So just because you're motivated to change doesn't mean you're necessarily going to actually make tangible reductions in your gambling behavior.
Yeah, like, I mean, I can't think of the number of times during my gambling where I would have like a big loss. I would be like, all right, I need to stop this. I need to go forward. I need to get better. But I didn't really have any tools to do that other than just like, let me pretend gambling doesn't exist. And so the motivation would eventually fade. I imagine it runs through kind of a similar pattern with that.
Oh, 100%. And a lot of the challenges, we have clients in our clinic who it's not at all uncommon for them to, file for bankruptcy. They're in the midst of a major fracture in their romantic relationship, or they've damaged other family relationships. And so if you say, all right, you now have motivation to change your gambling, those things are still going on in your life. And so the question is, what are you going to do now? For a lot of the clients in our clinic, the solution to that stress and those problems was to gamble. And so when you take that away, a lot of them have question marks of, well, what do I do now? So if I need social support to stop gambling, who am I going to talk to if my significant other is divorcing me? That is where I think the real challenge is. So I don't think that motivational interviewing is ineffective. I think on its own, you're probably unlikely to see consistent, reliable gains or improvements in your gambling, because people need more than just the motivation to stop.
And then you had mentioned another study in your presentation that I had seen previously, which was essentially showing people the severity of their financial losses and having that motivate change. Could you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah. So from a prevention model, what we find, so a lot of the context of what we're talking about now is like among people who have severe diagnosable gambling problems, whether they know it or not. So if you just motivate people in that group, people who have a real problem, that motivation alone is unlikely to change their behavior. If you kind of move one level up to people who are gambling but don't necessarily yet have severe problems with gambling, so they might have a consequence here or there, like they're tight on money this month because maybe they spent too much on the Super Bowl, things like that, just more minor consequences. When you give people these kind of motivational elements, things like asking about who they want to be and what their values are in their life, we actually find some effectiveness and reduction in the gambling behavior. Go beyond that one step. If we also give them feedback about how much they're spending on gambling, we can have even more of an effect. So the way these programs are designed are that we kind of at a base level ask them about motivation and who you are, what your values are. And when we then collect information about gambling and feed it back to them, we can use all of that in combination. So for example, if I said, we collected data on your gambling, and in the last 3 months, you spent $10,000 in gambling. This is, 50% of all your income. What do you think about that? When you start to just prompt people about that in the context of who they say they want to be, you have some interesting dialogues about where gambling fits within their life. So a very common thing people say, we're here in a academic institution. Every once in a while, we'll get college students who come in and they say, I'm in college because I want to be a lawyer. And I give them the feedback. So you're gambling 50% of your income. Where does that fit into some of the goals you articulate, like wanting to be a lawyer? Well, people say, well, that doesn't fit in there at all. Or they'll say, it's maybe not as important as studying. And I'd say, well, how would that inform your future behavior in gambling? I'd say, well, maybe I should probably spend less time on this and more time studying. So when we do that among a population of people who are exposed to gambling and, maybe not experiencing severe harm, yeah, we do see reductions in their gambling behavior. So it reduces some of the problems they experience gambling, the money that they spend on gambling, and how often they gamble. So it's a little bit of a population issue, but those kind of minimal interventions are effective from a prevention standpoint.
Yeah, it's making people aware of what they're doing, because
Yes.
when I think back to why I stopped gambling, it was because I finally asked myself, like, what is the point of what you're doing? And I just didn't have an answer anymore. It's helping prompt people to kind of question their reasoning for doing the thing that maybe they're just doing out of compulsion at this point.
I do think there's a kind of an insight problem here. We've done some research where if you ask people, do you have a gambling problem? And then you actually see diagnostically, do you have a gambling problem? What we find is that of the people who have a gambling problem, only about half of them say, yes, I do. And I do think there's an element of insight that a lot of people aren't really sure what a problem would mean for them, or they have very different ideas of what a problem is. I do think a lot of times it's more of a vague not knowing of what a problem would look like, but when you start to ask them about things, they start to maybe reconsider that maybe I do have a problem. But we do contextually have this societal background of people maybe not knowing about gambling yet or gambling problems. There is an element still, even though 10 years ago the American Psychiatric Association said this is an addiction, that is a diagnosable psychiatric problem. A lot of people still believe, this is just I'm having trouble managing my money, or I'm just in a jam right now. It doesn't necessarily connect to them that, hey, maybe I have something that I need to change, and this is bigger than just I'm in a financial jam right now. So I don't really know how to change that. I think there's a larger kind of education issue that is happening. I don't think we have sufficient public health knowledge or campaigns to say that gambling is an addiction. But if you ask people about alcohol, is alcohol addictive? I bet the majority of people would say yes. It's probably smaller for gambling. I don't know that, but
if everyone in the country knew what a gambling addiction looked like, what it was, how high would the rates of gambling addiction that are self-reported actually be?
I think they would be higher than they are now. There is an interesting group of people who, they're experiencing some problems, but they're not like at a diagnosable level. Who say like, yeah, I do. There seems to be a tolerance and like risk aversion aspect of people who, like, I'm very like risk averse, so I don't like want to spend a lot of money and lose it. Like that's just kind of who I am, and I think that's protective for me. But I think there are other people who they just may not really have that. I mean, their risk tolerance is very high. So there's a story a few years ago of a person in our clinic that they were embezzling money from a business. There was just like hundreds of thousands of dollars in a capital fund in a business, and they were using that money to spend on gambling. And when we asked them, so how come you were using that money to gamble? They're like, well, no one else was using that money anyway. It like did not register for them that they were committing a crime that they could be imprisoned for called embezzlement. You can't use money and spend it that's not yours. And so there was just no recognition or understanding that that was a problem. And when we kind of kept talking to them, they're like, well, no one got hurt by that. They just don't have that money anymore. That's very interesting to us because it just did not register. And it's like she wasn't lying, she wasn't being deceitful, but it just did not click that you are committing a crime right now.
Rory, thank you so much for joining and sharing not only your story of how you got into the work that you do, but also showing us the lens of research and what's been going on in the field. Because on this channel, we like to reflect on people's stories of addiction, but rarely do we get into the nitty-gritty of the research. So it was a really cool perspective. To anyone that's in the audience that wants to hear a story of someone in recovery from a gambling addiction, check out this video next. Let's keep getting better together, one day at a time.